The Vietnam War was a unique conflict that took place from 1955 up until 1975. The communist-backed North Vietnamese were at war with the US-backed South Vietnamese people. It was essentially the ultimate Cold War conflict. The United States was involved from 1965 until 1975, and the war claimed the lives of about 58,000 US troops. The legacy of the war in both the United States and in Vietnam was tragic. Some of the effects are still lingering today. In this video, we will explore the tragic legacy left behind by the Vietnam War. A televised war. The war was actually the first televised war. On a nightly basis, Americans would tune in to their TVs to watch bombing missions, soldiers on patrol, and scenes full of intense actual combat. These images put the war into the living rooms of millions of Americans all over the country. The reality of battles and bloodshed became must-watch television. It also put a face on the soldiers that were lost in combat and the civilians who were swept up in the middle of the chaos. The Vietnam War has been largely viewed as a war that was lost. One of the reasons behind the defeat was that Americans had the opportunity to see the good, the bad, and the ugly sides of this conflict from the comfort of their own homes. World War II coverage was conducted primarily through newspapers and the radio. Journalists had to follow strict guidelines and censorship rules forbidding images that were even remotely upsetting. What people saw with World War II coverage was more propaganda than anything else. Everything changed with the war in Vietnam, as people were given a harsh reality check. Television boomed in popularity during the 1950s, and for the first time, owning a television became a must. Only 9% of the US population owned a TV in 1950, but the number grew sharply to 99% by 1966. Television fought a fierce battle with newspapers and radio for entertainment and news coverage. By the 1960s, more Americans were getting their news from TV than ever before. The major networks decided to set aside 30 minutes dedicated to the nightly news and major stories. The war in Vietnam was hands down one of the most important stories taking place during the 1960s. Lyndon Baines Johnson was President of the United States when the country entered the war in 1965. He inherited the presidency after the tragic assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. And that's not all he inherited. The United States decided to take action in Vietnam to try and contain communism. The fear was that if one nation fell apart, a domino effect would take place. China had been lost, and there was a growing fear that East Asia would also fall to communism like Eastern Europe. The United States decided to step in and help South Vietnam in their battle against the communist Northern Vietnam. There were about 20,000 US troops in Vietnam during 1965. But just 3 years later, there were over 500,000 US troops. As the war continued, the fighting intensified, and the public's opinion shifted. It was 1968 when North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, a well-coordinated attack on South Vietnam that led to countless losses. A 1968 poll showed that 63% of the US population believed the Vietnam War was a major mistake. Along with the Tet Offensive, networks wanted increased coverage. They wanted more combat scenes for their dedicated viewers. The constant coverage and the unpopularity of the war led President Johnson to the decision not to seek re-election in 1968. Voters in the United States elected a new president in 1968. They had an opportunity to find a path to end the war, or else they'd continue with the madness that divided an entire nation. The role television played was pivotal to reporting the news coming out of Vietnam. It was created what was referred to as the living room war. By televising the war, the visions of the battlefield were burned into the minds of an entire generation. It would shape how wars were covered in the future, and it fueled the anti-war movement. How the media covered the war definitely changed. Correspondents would be extremely near the battles, and they'd show the actual conflict in action. What are your thoughts on the reporting of war in general? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. A divisive war and a country in chaos. While the war was being broadcast across the world, people were taking to the streets to voice their opposition to the fighting. Protests started in 1965, with the most notable being the March on Washington, D.C. that took place in April 1965. Some 15,000 to 25,000 people showed up to oppose the war. A pro-war rally was also held the same year in Washington, D.C. in October, and almost 25,000 people attended. In April 1967, protests were held in major cities like New York and San Francisco. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously spoke at the event in New York. Many of those who protested were young Americans. The reason why was because they were the ones being drafted into the war. A draft started in 1966, and students began protesting the selection of only men for service. Events at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and the University of Chicago ranged from peaceful protests to students occupying campus buildings demanding changes to draft policies. By 1968, protests were escalating steadily as the war became more and more unpopular. America became a crisis country in 1968. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. Riots erupted. Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, was seen as the man who would earn the Democrats' nomination as candidate for President of the United States. Sadly, Kennedy was also assassinated in Los Angeles, California on June 6, 1968. The 1968 Democratic Convention was supposed to be held in Chicago, Illinois during August 1968, and the city turned into a madhouse as the Chicago police clubbed anti-war protesters in the streets. 1968 turned into a chaotic year for the United States. Richard Nixon was elected president, and he showed no signs of backing out of the Vietnam War. Protests continued in the U.S. well into the early 1970s, and the most infamous protest happened at Ohio's Kent State University. On May 4, 1970, National Guardsmen fired into a crowd of students, killing 4 protesters. The reason for the protests was thanks to the war extending into Cambodia, which was announced not long before by President Nixon. A tired nation decided to protest, including students at Kent State University. Days of tension led to the infamous attack. Many U.S. cities and college campuses took a long time to heal after these countless protests and riots. Agent Orange and napalm. Napalm was a jellied gasoline that was used during the Vietnam War. It was first created in 1942 as part of a Harvard project known as Anonymous Research Project No. 4. It was tested on a soccer field on the university's campus. It would later become a key weapon for U.S. bombing missions. It rained down on Vietnam from 1963 until 1973. 100,000 tons of napalm was dropped in 1968 alone. Vietnam was not the first war where napalm was utilized. During World War II, about 690,000 pounds of napalm was dropped on Tokyo. What is unbelievable is that it was dropped in such a short amount of time, and it still killed about 87,000 people. Its use continued into the Korean War, and Americans had a front row seat to the use of napalm during the Vietnam War. Television reports and photographs showed the sheer destruction of this brutal weapon. Victims were shown badly burned or even burned to death. A 1967 New York Times article stated, "Anyone who survives a napalm attack is apt to be dreadfully burned and, without first-rate medical care, is condemned to a lingering, painful death, or at best, permanent disfigurement." When dropped and ignited, napalm could burn up to 1,500 to 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a horrible liquid fire that showed no mercy in its destruction. Napalm clung to anything, including human skin, and it burned people alive. So why was it used by the US military? One pilot remembered, "People have this thing about being burned to death." Dow Chemical, a company in Midland, Michigan that created Saran Wrap, was actually awarded a contract in 1965 by the US government to make napalm. Dow tried recruiting college students in the 1960s, but were instead met by anti-war protesters. Another deadly weapon used during the Vietnam War was Agent Orange. It was an herbicide that was sprayed to destroy the food supply of communists in North Vietnam. The main purpose of it was to defoliate forests in certain regions to discourage communist soldiers from seeking shelter in the woods. Since 1962, it's believed that almost 100 million pounds of herbicides like Agent Orange were sprayed on some 4 million acres of land in Vietnam. It was also sprayed in neighboring countries like Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. but information about the amount actually used is unavailable. Spraying reportedly killed about 1,000 civilians and 13,000 livestock. Agent Orange and other herbicides were incredibly toxic, and their legacy created countless problems for the Vietnamese and US troops that were exposed to the chemicals. An Encyclopedia Britannica entry for Agent Orange said, "Exposure to Agent Orange is considered to be the cause of abnormally high incidence of miscarriages, skin diseases, cancers, birth defects, and congenital malformations, often extreme and grotesque, dating from the 1970s. Almost 150,000 Vietnamese children were born with birth defects thanks to Agent Orange and other herbicides used during the war. 3 million US soldiers that served during the Vietnam War were exposed to chemicals like Agent Orange. In total, 9 million people served for the US military during the war in Vietnam. The US government invested about $400 million to environmental cleanup and benefits for people with disabilities from Agent Orange. The US states that it's rather difficult to determine if Agent Orange was the actual cause of the disabilities in certain cases. The use of Agent Orange finally stopped in 1971 by the US government after the harmful effects were fully realized. Veterans from the US and other countries tried taking the producers of Agent Orange and other herbicides to court in the 1970s, with the case being settled out of court years later in 1984. 250,000 claimants and their families were granted access to a $180 million fund. It is reported that 300,000 Vietnam veterans passed away from diseases and complications linked to the exposure of herbicides like Agent Orange. Children of these veterans believe that their father's exposure to Agent Orange possibly affected them in different ways. Some claim that different cancers are linked to Agent Orange, along with complications to pregnancies and more. The trouble for Vietnam vets. Veterans that came home from the war were not even given a grand homecoming. They were met with cold shoulders in a country that was divided over war. Adjustment was difficult, and many Vietnam veterans struggled after their return. Some turned to drugs and alcohol just to cope. Something that impacted the veterans more than other war veterans was their time in combat. Vietnam War veterans typically saw 240 days of combat. Those who served during World War II saw just 40. Retired Marine Sergeant Andrew Brandy conducted research and found that some Vietnam veterans saw an astonishing 1,200 days of combat. If you think you don't have issues after 1,200 days of combat, you need to think again, said Brandy. What was lacking for many veterans returning from Vietnam was resources like counseling. The time when veterans were coming home was a time when mental health institutions in the United States were experiencing a period of change. Many fell through the cracks, and a 1991 article titled "Vietnam Era and Vietnam Combat Veterans Among the Homeless" stated that 43 to 50% of homeless men at the time were actually Vietnam veterans. The period in which these men were homeless ranged from a month to over a year. It is still important to examine this pressing issue. The ability to adjust after war proved difficult for some veterans. Homelessness and addiction have been major issues from the 1980s well into the 2000s. This was a similar situation faced by veterans of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Unexploded bombs and landmines. Although U.S. involvement in Vietnam officially ended in 1975, there are still problems in the country today with unexploded bombs and landmines. A 2023 Al Jazeera article said that out of all the artillery used in the Vietnam War, a third of it never exploded. One province alone has had 3,500 deaths since the war ended, thanks to people finding unexploded bombs and landmines. But Vietnam as a nation has experienced a total of 100,000 deaths due to this major issue. A British organization called the Mines Advisory Group has spent time in Vietnam since 1999 to search the land with metal detectors for hidden dangers. From 1993 until 2020, the United States invested $166 million on programs to help with landmines and unexploded bombs in Vietnam. About 67 square miles have been searched, but it is going to take another 13 years to completely clear Vietnam of unexploded bombs and landmines. There are even stories of children finding these dangerous items and playing with them. In some cases, nothing happens. but in others. This is not just an isolated issue. PBS reported that the State Department estimates around 60 to 75 million landmines remain unexploded in the ground worldwide. The U.S. is involved in similar programs in Iraq, Afghanistan, Laos, and Cambodia to combat this. Do you have any other stories related to the Vietnam War you'd like us to make a video about? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!